squelched and scrubbed. That one was all of the boys had to conform to naval discipline. They couldn't get the students, and they couldn't get the ship. God bless you. And so World War I came about, and there was no shipboard education. If you look at who would be considered the founder of shipboard education, you have to look back to a man by the name of James Lowe. He was at New York University, and it was his desire to take a ship around the world. He was in continuing education at New York University, and he believed that he could take a ship around the world with students, give them credit, and bring them back with a very, very quick analysis of the world that they lived in. James Lowe tried his best and ran into quite a bit of trouble at New York University, so he set up his own company called University Travel Association. And the Rhine Dam set sail from Hoboken, New Jersey on September, I have to go back to dates because I'm a historian and I don't like dates, but I'll give it to you anyway. September 18th, 1926, with a full quota of 504 students, a faculty and administrative staff of 63 people. It was a ship called the Rhine Dam. It was decorated from stem to stern with flags. Thousands lined up on 5th Street to see the ship sail. When it left, there were tears, as there were when we left. There were 143 colleges represented on board, as well as the former governor of Kansas, who became the ship's newspaper writer and put out the Binnacle, as it was called. They had a crew of 256 crew members, mostly from the Netherlands, and no one believed that they were going to be able to do it. But that first voyage in 1926 sailed for 7.5 months, went around the world, traveled 41,000 miles, visited 35 countries, and more than 90 cities during the course of that 7.5 months. They went to places like Shanghai, Hong Kong, Manila, Bangkok, Colombo, Bombay, Haifa, Venice, Gibraltar, Lisbon, Oslo, and eventually came back to New York. Their first sailing was they left New York or New Jersey, went through the Panama Canal, and went immediately to Yokohama, where they were given a rousing welcome in Yokohama, just as we were given a rousing welcome when we arrived in Kobe. In September of 1976, I had the pleasure of visiting the Queen Mary in Long Beach and talking to people from that voyage 50 years later. It was an interesting evening as they reminisced about their voyage. And some of the things they said during that period were, they remembered a man named Benito Mussolini who had held a reception for them while they were in Rome. They remembered Jack Morgan, who spent his pocket money for the entire voyage in Japan. And then they remembered and recalled, because Jack was there at that reunion, send Jack cash, which was the word everybody used during the course of that voyage. Send Jack cash meant, I'm out of money, Mom. I need more. There was also an interesting thing, because they were horrified when they first saw their cabins, which were only 6 by 6 by 6. They were all partitioned cubicles in the hold of the ship. And they remembered that 2 people shared each cubicle, and that the tall people had to sleep with their bent knees. They also remembered the particular smell of the ship 50 years later. And probably the most interesting thing that happened to me in the last couple of days was I pointed out a young man, well, he's not that young anymore, who visited with us from Hong Kong to Japan, Zhou Qingwei. And even though this ship is only 3 years old, Zhou Qingwei came on the ship, walked on the gangway, walked into Purser Square and said, it smells the same. All ships, I guess, have a smell. And he himself said it. And I said, Qingwei, you can't be saying that because it's such a new ship. He said, no, there is a smell to all ships. And that's what the people 50 years later, from 1926 to 1976, remembered. They also remembered, and this is something quite interesting, that men outnumbered the women 4-1. Little different today than it was in 1926. Well, Dean Lowe decided after that 7.5-month voyage to keep shipboard education alive. He tried his best, and we believe from 1926 to 1933, there were attempts at voyages. Some sailed and some did not sail. Most of the time it was because they couldn't get the enrollments that they needed to make it a go and financially make the thing worthwhile. But they worked hard at it. And in fact, in 1932, one of the voyages came back remembering quite clearly the visit they had when, I think it was George Bernard Shaw visited with the students when they were in London, and Gandhi met the students when they were in India, when they were in Calcutta. And they remembered after they got to Bombay that Gandhi was put in jail for his desire to see India changed at that time during the independence movement. He spoke very sympathetically to the students, asked them to read Mother India, and he said to them, you need to be there with your own eyes and travel to the countries and make up your own mind as to what should be done in the future. Sounds a little bit like the story we heard when our dear friend Archbishop Tutu spoke to us as we sailed from Salvador to Cape Town. It was 23 years later before shipboard education could get really off the ground. And it happened, in some respects, people say it was a fluke. Some people say it was well planned. And the man who put it all together said he didn't know who made the decision to make him chairman of the committee to see if they could put together a program called University of the Seven Seas. It came about in a Rotary Club in Whittier, California. The president of that club said, I want you, William Hughes, to see if you can bring this into fruition and do something about shipboard education. Hughes' response to his president at that time, he said, quote, I don't know who made the mistake, Dr. Black or God, but I got the job. And he did. And the interesting thing about Bill Hughes was he put his own money into it. I remember seeing him on the ship, our old ship, the Universe, and he confessed to several of us who were involved with shipboard education at the time that he put together somewhere between $50,000 and $100,000 to see if he could make the University of the Seven Seas come together as a program and as a floating university. I want you to see something that happened to that first University of Seven Seas. Run the first tape for me, guys. You're going to have to turn the lights off here.
In a world that's getting smaller all the time, one of the challenges that's intrigued both educators and students has been how to use the world itself as a kind of living textbook. The problem, though, has been getting from country to country without cutting classes, or put another way, circling the globe and being in college at the same time. Well, here's one answer, one of the most unusual innovations in higher education. This is a floating university, the University of the Seven Seas. The university, with 216 students, sailed from New York October 19th. The semester runs 108 days and includes 17 ports of call. Last stop, San Diego, February 3rd next year. The university's campus is 492 feet long, 69 feet wide. Tuition, $500 a semester, plus between $1,600 and $2,200 for accommodations. And you're an undergraduate in this Cruise for Credit course around the world.
Check the dress code.
Here, the university, which is now in its second year, is tied up in the waters off the Indian port of Bombay. The other stops so far have included Lisbon, Naples, Beirut, and the Suez. At sea, classes are held daily except Sundays, but in port, no classes are held, and the 5,000-volume library isn't used much. The students leave the floating university. They come from an assortment of colleges and universities, New Mexico, Colorado, Illinois, and Arizona, among others. They board a launch for the short ride into Bombay, and then Bombay itself becomes the campus. The discovery of India begins. Students go on field study trips. There's a bit of history to see, such as the famous gateway to India. Inevitably, there's a performance by the local snake charmer. This is probably under the heading of local cultural idiosyncrasies. And one student enrolls in a course that could be called Snake Charming 1. Back aboard the university, it's time for a snack. The menu is all American, but the dress isn't all blue jean. One of the students, Mary Johnston of Portsmouth, Virginia, is being given a cram course in the sari. Mary is in her junior year. She plans to attend San Fernando State College in California next spring.
Most of the Indian saris are 6 yards long.
6 yards, that's all.
Yes, and then you'll have to tuck it.
Okay, that was one of the first voyages with the University of Seven Seas. I don't know if you recognized, all of you in the room who could recognize. That was Marvin Kalb who was doing the interview. And Marvin Kalb, I remember, became quite famous as a CBS correspondent. The difficulty that the University of Seven Seas had was they also needed a sponsor. Bill Hughes's plan was to actually build a campus in a city near San Diego and call it the University of the Seven Seas and actually begin giving credit from that college in Southern California. That never really got off the ground, and he began to have difficulty in the second year when students would come back saying, who will give the academic credit and how will we get our academic credit for the voyage around the world? It just so happened, and this is where Semester at Sea is quite interesting in terms of people being in the right place at the right time. On that last voyage of the University of the Seven Seas, there was a couple that got very involved in it by the name of Jack and Valerie Scudder. In fact, Valerie Scudder and her oldest son, John, were on the last voyage of the University of the Seven Seas and became quite intrigued with the idea. They have remained very important benefactors to shipboard education through the years, and there's an actual Valerie Scudder scholarship that is still in existence, and the family still contributes to it each year. Valerie Scudder was also on the board of a small school named Chapman College in Southern California. And Valerie went to a board meeting and said, I just came back from a remarkable experience on the University of the Seven Seas. They need an academic home. They need an academic sponsor. Would you, Chapman College, be interested in taking it on? The gentleman who did decide was a man by the name of John Davis, who was president of Chapman College at the time. And he decided that it might not be a bad idea for us to take this on. He remembers telling his faculty, it's one of the most difficult decisions I ever made as the president of Chapman College. But they decided to go ahead and took over the University of the Seven Seas and ran it for another year or two under the title University of the Seven Seas. In 1965, Chapman College decided that they would like to see the program continue and grow. So they decided to call it something different, and they called it World Campus Afloat. And it became a new program with the university, with the Chapman College, and at that time, it was run on the Rhine Dam too. So let's look a little bit at the tape when Chapman College took it over, and we'll see the second tape.
Chapman College is a small, independent, church-related liberal arts school in Orange, California, that believes it has a direct obligation to push back the all too confining limitations of traditional education. In 1965, Chapman began a shipboard campus program in which students and faculty would live together in an academic community, traveling the world, seeing and experiencing in foreign ports what they studied in class aboard ship. Since that time, this magnetic concept has attracted several thousand students, not only from Chapman, but from hundreds of colleges all over the country and abroad. Now, with the help of scholarships and loans, any student who is academically qualified can find the means to have this experience. And credits for courses offered on the ship transfer readily to other academic institutions. To accommodate the entire academic community, Holland America Line converted a 15,000-ton air-conditioned liner into a fully equipped shipboard college. In addition to academic facilities, which include 12 classrooms, a science lab, and study areas, the ship provides all the services of a land-bound community. But the greatest service offered by the ship is that it's one of the best means of transportation for extended traveling. The ship provides a home away from home. Traveling inland requires only a light bag, and if land excursions do become wearisome, students can return to familiar surroundings and friends back on board the ship. But most important, the ship is the academic focus of the voyage. The ballroom and lounges that once vibrated to the strains of the ship's orchestra now buzz with the rattle of typewriters and the chatter of students. The 10,000-volume library holdings have been selected to meet research needs for the curriculum and to provide a collection of reference works and a large browsing section. Half the semester is spent on board, and while at sea, regular college classes meet 6 days a week. It is here in class where students are prepared for upcoming ports. Professors spend a great deal of time adjusting their material to each country on the itinerary. This preparation includes everything from the country's history, economy, political structure and language, to tips on places to visit and questions to ask.
I'm hoping that I'm going to talk Gail into it. These are 3 different tapes of the history of shipboard education, and maybe some late night you'll turn your TV on and be able to watch. I think it's only about 45 to 50 minutes, and you can see all 3 of these tapes in their entirety. But I didn't want to take the whole time to show that and not tell you some of the little tidbits about what happened to shipboard education. Chapman did one thing for the program. They gave it stability from 1965 to 1975. And it was during that period that they worked out all kinds of kinks as far as how the program should be run. One of the things that I never experienced, because I wasn't a part of the shipboard program when it was on the Rhine Dam, was that every semester, every year, they would run a fall semester and a spring semester. And at the end of the spring semester, we would take, or the Chapman people would take the ship completely down. The library would be packed up and put in the hold, and then the Holland American people would run a summer program. And at the start of the fall semester, the library would be brought up from the hold, primarily with a whole group of students helping out. It would be set up, the classrooms would be set off, and we would run a fall and a spring semester. Sometimes they ran a 2 or 3 week voyage between semesters, but for the most part, the semesters were longer. There were 114 days. They usually visited anywhere from 12 to 14 countries, and many times they were gone over the Christmas holidays. In one of these tapes, you actually see Santa Claus coming down in a big box with the big overhead, bringing cookies and candy down to the students so that they could celebrate Christmas Day while they were on the ship. And New Year's. They would have New Year's Eve parties on the ship before they came back to either the West Coast or the East Coast when it was being run by the Rhine Dam, on the Rhine Dam. It was about halfway through the tenure at Chapman that a gentleman stepped forward and said he would like to get involved in shipboard education. And in 1969 and 1970, a gentleman who many of you see almost every day when you walk this ship, Mr. C.Y. Tung, decided that he wanted to get involved in shipboard education. It was at the same time that Holland America was saying, we don't know if we want to continue using or allowing you to use the Rhine Dam because we're losing money on it. So Tung set up a meeting with the people at Chapman College and said, hey, I have a great idea for you. Ships can carry ideas as well as cargo, and I just bought a ship that I think would be an outstanding ship for your program. He bought the Queen Elizabeth I, a ship that could take over 2,000 people, a ship that was world-renowned because of the work that it did, particularly during the war, carrying the troops back and forth to Europe. And it was sitting idle in Florida, very close to Fort Lauderdale, where we usually dock. And he decided to buy it. He bought it and told Chapman, I will give you this ship on a special contract if you use it for your program. Chapman at first was a little reluctant. They had been operating on the Rhine Dam with maybe 400, 450 students. What are we going to do with space for 2,000? How would we accommodate 2,000 people? And it was finally decided that they would continue discussions with C.Y. Tung to see if it would be possible. C.Y. took the ship, had it towed to the Caribbean, worked on it in the Caribbean, sailed it to Hong Kong, and spent over $6 million on the ship to retrofit it and renovate it to make it CY's University. And it was going to operate and begin operations in somewhere between either 1971 or 1972. Well, unfortunately, in 1970-71, the ship caught fire in Hong Kong Harbor, and it burned completely up in Hong Kong Harbor. It was an unbelievable fire. And there are still stories from many, many people that where did the fire start? How did it start? Who started it? There were stories that it could have been Chinese in mainland China who were very, very jealous of the success of C.Y. Tung. By this time, he had over 150 ships on the high seas. They thought possibly that could have been done. Some people went so far as to say that it was done to collect the insurance money because they had spent too much on it. That one I didn't believe at all. But it was a tragedy, not only for the shipping industry, but for Chapman. And the joke around the Chapman campus, at least 4 or 5 years later, was they were going to start answering the phone, World Campus Afire, rather than World Campus Afloat. But it was a terrible joke. But it was interesting because this is another aspect of where and how shipboard education was able to maintain itself. I firmly believe that if Chapman began to use the Queen Elizabeth I, shipboard education probably would have had only a 2 or 3 year lifespan after that, because it would have been impossible to operate a ship for 2,000 people and try to put 500 students on it, maybe 1,500 senior adults, and try to travel around the world and do a program with that many people. It just didn't seem logical to many of the people who were involved with shipboard education. But C.Y. Tung was in a dilemma. He had already said to Chapman, I will make sure you have a ship. Chapman gave up its contract with the Holland American Line, and C.Y. Tung went out and bought another ship called the Atlantic. It was a ship sitting idle in Baltimore Harbor. It had been there for 3 or 4 years. It was built as a Badger and Mariner class. It was supposed to be a ship that would have been used in the Korean War. It never did come into any work or any time sailing in the Korean War. And it began crossing the Atlantic, hence the name, the SS Atlantic. And that was in the early 60s, mid-60s, that it started going from New York to London and back to New York. Well, at the same time it was sailing, the jet age came into being, and people began to fly from New York to London and back, and the ship started losing money and eventually ended up in Baltimore, I think is where it was put up, in a dry dock. And C.Y. Tung found it, and we believe he only spent $1.5 million to buy the ship. He immediately told Chapman, we have a ship. They started to work on it. People from Chapman went to Baltimore and sailed with it through the Panama Canal. When they got to the Panama Canal, they had a major flood on the ship. It arrived in Long Beach with every carpet almost on every deck soaking wet. They were doing their best with fans and everything to dry it out. The students arrived to start on the fall 1971 voyage and were aghast at the ship's condition and what it looked like. And there was some fear that the ship wasn't going to make it around the world. Well, that fear turned into a reality when it lost one of its engines on its first stop, which was Honolulu, Hawaii. And they spent an extra 4 or 5 days in Honolulu while they tried to make sure the ship was seaworthy and they could sail on. Well, that ship, as many trials and tribulations we had with the old Universe, he had renamed it the Universe Campus, operated under Chapman's guidance from 1971 till 1975. And it was, again, a fate thing that comes up with shipboard education. In 1975, Chapman College went into financial difficulty. Even though the enrollments were somewhere between 400 to 450, Chapman ran out of money. And Chapman made the decision in the fall of 1975 to discontinue World Campus Afloat. It was a shock to all of us. It was a major shock to myself and my family because we had been involved from 1972 until 1975. I took a full-time position with Chapman College in 1974, and less than a year later, I didn't have a job, and the program was going to be scrapped completely. Mr. Tung stepped up again, and he said, Chapman, you have a baby, and I want to see it growing. I want to see it mature. I will do my best to continue the program after 1975 if you do two things for me. One, will you give me all of the inquiries that were accumulating from about October or November when we canceled the program until sometime in early 1976? And two, would you give me the library that you have on the ship on loan so that we would at least have a library? Well, that library had been packed up by students like yourselves in 1975. They had ammunition cans in the hold that we used to pack the books in. And we had them packed up after the 75 voyage. And I'll never forget going into Haiti at the end of the voyage, because I was on the ship that voyage, and we ran out of boxes. And we arrived in Haiti, and we ran out of the ammunition cans. They were literally ammunition cans from World War II that were waterproof, and we could use it. So when we got to Haiti, I said to the agent, I need boxes. Can you help me get some boxes so that we can finish packing the library? And he said, sure, let's go. And he pulled up in a pickup truck, and we got in his truck, and we drove to